All right, guys, welcome to another episode. You might recognize Mike. He's been here before. Thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Always a pleasure.
So, we had a pretty good conversation last time, and so that's why I asked you to come back. And, you and I went hunting earlier this week, and we're having some pretty, interesting conversations. And so I figured it was good to kind of do this,
Yeah.
We're talking a little bit about a lot of this disclosure stuff that's going on right now with the UFOs, and it's a crazy time for sure.
Yeah, I think the and I've been a follower of the whole topic for a long time. It actually started. I think one of the first books I read was a day after Roswell. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso. I think anybody that has an interest in the topic, I always say that's a pretty good book to start with. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that was he worked under Eisenhower and he ran the Foreign Intelligence Desk. And so he was able to see a lot of stuff that was coming through that the military was sort of discovering out in the field. And specifically, the book is about not the event of Roswell as much as all the tech that they were able to recover from the site. And what really makes that book pretty legitimate is that in the foreword, Senator Strom Thurmond, who's a very well known senator from that time, and I think he retired sometime in the early 80s or something. But he wrote the foreword, basically said that Corso was who he says he was and worked at where he says he was. But in essence, the whole book is about that a lot of the tech that we see today was seeded into the private sector based on what they were discovering out in the field. And everything from like the circuit breakers to Kevlar jackets to night vision, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the jump in technology, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were kind of talking about how, from 1800 to 1900 there's not a lot of tech inventions,
Yeah.
But then from, 1950 to 2026, it's massive, and I've also heard about the fiber optics. That's another thing that came from that era.
Yeah.
And it is very strange to see, how much technology growth has happened in that short time period.
I mean, you look at what we have with the cell phone. I mean, that's got more power and abilities than what was going up on in the Apollo missions,
Mm-hmm.
those rockets. I mean, so we hold more computer bandwidth in just that phone than what was in the mainframe computers back in the 50s and 60s. So I mean, the acceleration of that is just really crazy.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what exactly are they hiding from us. I feel like there's probably you've heard of 0-point energy. I feel like that has been developed multiple times, and I was reading something about that. When there's one of these technologies and patented now, that it goes under a top secret type of cover, it's not released to the public when somebody develops some technology like that now.
Yeah, you can there's throughout kind of the 19th century or the 20th century, there have been many inventors. For example, whether it's a hydrogen car that ran on water, or we had electric cars in the early 1900s in New York City driving around. And so, every time there seems to be someone makes an advancement in technology, and there's a patent that is submitted, if that technology sort of potentially can disrupt the current system, then the government does two things. Either they buy it out and say thank you very much, and then that goes into sort of the black cover of the military-industrial complex, or they snuff it out. They push it out because it's could be disruptive. There's like the story around Tesla where one of his early backers was J.P. Morgan, and Tesla then created this when he created the ability to transfer electricity without wires, that he could actually direct it and point it to certain places, and what he described was that he was going to have free energy. And J.P. Morgan apparently said, well, why would we need that?
Yeah.
How do we charge for that? And then shortly afterwards he died, and that was the story there. So there's I think what we see is that if it's not part of the program, then you're susceptible to either being bought out, which in those cases, those guys get paid a lot of money and they just go away and stay quiet, or they put some national security thing on it where you can't take it out and monetize it in the public sector.
I've heard that a lot of those patents that Tesla originally had were bought by like Trump's grandfather. Have you heard that?
Yeah. In fact, it was his uncle. I think it was, or maybe
that's what I think it was his uncle.
His uncle, yeah. His uncle was like the key person that was reviewing the Tesla documents after his death. Yeah,
and there's that very strange book that was written too about Baron Trump and the time traveler.
Yeah,
it's all of it seems very strange to me, almost like we're in some type of a simulation or something.
Totally.
Yeah, we were talking the other day about the new Bob Lazar movie that came out, and they used a lot of AI in that film to kind of show you what he saw. And what I really liked about the film is, I wanted to see more, but they didn't show you anything more than what he saw. So he's kind of stuck to that same story throughout all these years. But listening to the podcast where he and the director were on, and they were talking about how they had been at this facility since like the 1950s, which would have been, the Roswell crash.
Yeah.
And no telling how long because this was, I think it was 88 or 89 when Lazar was there, and no telling how long they had been working on these projects of reverse engineering these craft. But it's, it seemed like at that time they didn't fully understand, how everything worked. And Lazar was talking about how one of the generators that they had, cut off with a torch from one of the craft, they wanted to power it up and then cut into it. I don't know if with like a torch or a grinder or something, but cut into it and see what happens. And the scientist or guy that was there before Lazar had died during that experiment, and that's why Lazar was brought in. He wasn't told fully that that's what happened, but he talks about his lab partner Barry, who had been there before him, kind of like clued him in on a lot of the stuff that had happened.
Yeah, I really like that movie too. It's called S4 if you guys haven't checked it out. But the Bob Lazar, like there's certain within the whole sort of UFO storyline, there are certain people that really have come through as I think catalyst for disclosure. And I would say Bob Lazar is probably at the top of the list.
Yeah.
I mean, the quick backstory on him was he was, he's just a physicist, scientist, kind of a independent-minded type guy. Grew up just loving anything that had to do with speed. He put like a rocket on the back. He had this little Honda Civic, and he put a rocket on the back of it and drive it around. And in the movie, it gives you sort of that history a little bit in the front end of which I thought was really helpful. And then how he got to S4 or Area 51 was he worked at Los Alamos Labs for a bit. Then he moved out west, and around the time he was working at Los Alamos Labs, he met with Teller. I forget the first name of the scientist, very famous scientist, and anyway, had sent him his his resume, and Teller and they had some interaction when he was in Los Alamos, so they kind of know each other, and Teller also was very impressed with Lazar's abilities to like convert like normal tech and add a rocket on it or anything else. And so when he reached out to Teller again a couple years later, Teller said to him, "Hey, I think there may be something that you may be good at, or would be of interest to you." And then that's how he connected him to the whole Area 51 thing. And so as you said, once he got there, his whole role was just about the propulsion system, like they're trying to figure out how the propulsion system worked on these crafts. And it's actually, the movie's pretty technical. So, I mean, he talks a lot about how it worked and how it was designed. It's in a weird way, it's pretty simple. And then in another way, it's just like, wow. But I think the whole 0 point energy thing is, I think it's something that honestly we have. And I really think about a lot, and this is going to go kind of way out in the way, edges here. But if you think about the amount of energy that it's going to take for us to power AI sufficiently, I was listening to another podcast that had, one of the CEOs, one of the big AI firms, but in Abilene. In Abilene, OpenAI has a data center that is the size of size of Central Park, but it uses half of the energy that Manhattan uses on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's insane.
And then in Louisiana, there's another facility, which is Meta, Facebook. Their facility is like the size is bigger than that, and it's using almost the amount of energy that Manhattan uses on a daily basis.
Yeah, and they also have to supply it with water too, right? I know that's
right.
been a big issue right now here in Texas that I've seen. Our agriculture commissioner is in support of these data centers, and he's an older guy that's probably part of that good old boy network. And
right.
There's a younger guy that's kind of like running for this office too, and I don't think he would get elected because just on the fact that he opposes a lot of these data centers. But there's a lake in Corpus Christi, and I guess they have a data center in that area, and that lake is drying up now because of how much water that it uses. And I've seen a lot of farms, where these data centers come in, they're like, hey, we'll buy this for millions of dollars, and people are kind of getting wise to that and not selling. But I think it's just a matter of time before they're built anyway. I think we're past the point of fighting AI. It's here, and it's just my biggest concern is like what happens to our resources in like 20 years. I don't even think it's not 50 years. It's 10, 20 years down the road.
Yeah. I mean, there was another facility. It's actually Elon Musk data center in Memphis, and they put this facility in. The local population didn't know anything about it. It's in an area, sort of like lower income part of Memphis. Anyway, there's a couple lawsuits because the residents there, started smelling sulfur constantly. And they thought there was all these gas leaks or whatever else, but it wasn't. It was actually the data center that was located nearby. And so now it's created this sort of environmental hazard that, that is impacting the local community. And they're like, they had no choice in it. It was just there.
I think you're going to see that happen a lot more, and people don't realize that these data centers are everywhere. It's not like there's one or two of them. I mean, they're constantly building new ones over and over again. So it's and to go back to 0 point energy, in that movie S4, they kind of showed this. What is it? It's the element 115.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And when they showed it, it was cut into like a triangular shape, and he was explaining in the podcast that the shape actually has something to do with creating that energy force. He said they were cut into triangles, and there were some that were in diamonds on some of the other machines. But if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. I mean, they're essentially like flooding this element with some type of a radiation, and then that creates a like a gravity field or lack of gravity, anti-gravity field around something. And it's not that it pushes the machine, it falls into that space. So that makes sense why, in that sport model, I mean, it's it's kind of like a what do you call it? A disc. It turns onto its side, because to me, that's where it would have more weight, right? I mean, if you think about like a 2x4, weight is kind of distributed evenly, and it might be kind of hard for that to move in a plane. But when it turns onto its side, now it's kind of falling. So weight is pulling down, at least in like, my brain, that's the way I think it would work.
Yeah. So I think that whole sort of exotic energy is where I think the whole disclosure thing, this is my personal opinion, the whole disclosure thing is really pointing to. Mm-hmm. Again, I think we've had a lot of this tech, hidden in the sort of private sector with the defense contractors and so on, and it's at what point does that tech be part of what's supporting sort of the public side of society, and the only way to sort of introduce that in a way that I think makes the public would accept and makes some sense would be through some type of disclosure, and I think the motivation for that is back to sort of like our energy needs, specifically in AI, because they even talked that we could build more nuclear plants and whatever else, but even that is not going to be sufficient enough to power all our power needs. I mean, we are really kind of, I think, at a place where we're going to have to figure out a new energy, and I think this is going to be one of those things. That's my personal point of view.
Yeah, I mean, they say that 2026 is supposed to be the year of disclosure, and when you have the president, talking openly about, alien spacecraft, it's very strange, and it's kind of lining up with what you read. And supposedly the year of 2027 is where we see like the first alien being. Yeah.
I know this sounds crazy.
I mean, yeah, for sure. It definitely sounds crazy, but you have all of these people in Congress that are, Tim Burchett is the prime one that I think of, where he's saying, the things that he's been disclosed would make Americans sick, and like it would change society. And then you have Matt Gaetz, who was another guy that was in Congress for a while, and he's saying that there's, alien human hybrids, and this used to be kind of like fringe stuff. You would hear it from Alex Jones. He was probably like the guy that you heard the most, and I can remember 20 years ago, a guy in the office listening to Alex Jones, and it's like, this guy is nuts. Like, but now, he's been wrong on several things, but this interdimensional demons basically is something you've heard him say are likely real.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if you look at, think about just this year, I mean, just moving past what's going on sort of in geopolitical, craziness. You have, in this year, Spielberg is releasing a blockbuster it's called Age of Disclosure, or Disclosure, I think it's called. That's going to be this summer. And the premise of that movie is basically that the hybrids are here, and that there's some moment where, society realizes that we're not alone and we've got all these people around us. You got the Lazar movie that we just talked about, which is a big release. You got SpaceX going public, and and then we got the Artemis 2 they just went around supposedly, backside of the moon and all that.
I like how you put supposedly in there because I kind of agree with you there. Yeah.
I mean, that's another topic.
Yeah.
But, there's just a lot of noise in the system about, and then all the hearings that are going on in Congress constantly about this subject and more whistleblowers coming out. There's just a lot of noise. And then the president clearly coming out and saying that they're going to, release files, and that's going to happen here, soon. It all is directing us the attention to something. Yeah. And I think we just have to be mindful of that. I think that's, we may be talking about in normal ways that, there's this other things that are happening outside of humanity that that could rewrite how we understand humanity overall.
Yeah, I think that information has probably been out there longer than what people realize. I mean, just take since, modern Hollywood has been around, how many movies have you seen that have been about an alien race coming to the United States or coming to the world, or, invasion of the body snatchers, people, these beings taking over other people's bodies, Independence Day. I mean, that was a huge film with Will Smith. I'm a big believer in that life is imitating art.
Yeah.
And these are people that are in the know, and they're creating these stories to almost normalize it so that when it does happen, because I feel like if, my grandparents were alive at this time and you started telling them this stuff, it would be shocking. But for you and I, we've kind of been indoctrinated into this reality of aliens are potentially real. I mean, we're aliens, right? If we were to go to another planet, so why couldn't it be possible that something else is real?
Yeah. What do you think they are?
I don't know. I mean, so what I've read is that there's like certain different races, right? There's the Nordics, which look similar to us. And if I were to say, which ones would they disclose first, I would imagine it would be that, because that's going to be the easiest for people to accept. And then you've heard about the Greys. I mean, since I was a kid, I've heard about those. And to me, those don't seem like they're a living being. It's almost like they're a clone or something, because of the fact that they have like no genitals. Their mouth is very small. They have giant eyes. And then I've heard about the ones that look like a praying mantis. Those seem like they're those and reptilians are like the two most dangerous to the human race, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know which one of those I believe. I would say maybe like the Nordics and the Greys. I definitely believe, because I can't tell you how many. As a kid, I was like really drawn to that, and I was also terrified at the same time, because I can remember watching these videos of like, what was that show that
Leonard Nimoy's.
Yeah, there was that one, and then there was also like that like Unexplained or something. I can't remember the guy's name, but
wasn't Shatner, was it?
No, it was another guy. But they would do like, stories. Sometimes it would be ghosts, and sometimes it'd be murders, and then sometimes it'd be aliens. And I remember seeing this one video where these kids were playing, and they saw another kid, and the kid had like blonde hair, and they chased after the kid. And when they caught up to him, he turns and he's like, he's a gray, And as a kid, I was like, that would be kind of cool to see, but also like terrifying at the same time. And then what was that movie? Fire in the Sky. Do you remember that one that came out? And that guy's story hasn't changed either. And
what's his name?
I can't remember what the guy's name, but they were in Canada, right? They were
that was actually in Arizona. I think it was,
but they were like loggers. Or
they were loggers.
Right?
Yeah, mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so he touches this craft while it's operating, and something happens to him, and he's abducted, and and it seemed like they were like healing him, right?
Yeah.
But the movie kind of made it spun as like they were experimenting on him or something.
Yeah.
But it's a very strange movie if you had never seen it. But he also did Joe Rogan's podcast, and like his story it's pretty wild. Like it hasn't changed.
And then he also, his story was collaborated by the folks that was with him.
Yeah.
The guys who were with him. So, and they never changed their story.
Yeah.
And he ends up showing up, like they had a mass manhunt for him, couldn't find him. And I think it was, 3 or 5 days later, he just shows up and lost a bunch of weight. Beard had grown out, and immediately told the story that he was on this craft and was getting poked at. And I think on the Rogan podcast, he gets into a little bit more detail where, it was one of these gray beings was sort of like poking at him, and he came out of whatever trance they had put him, and he actually attacked one of them. And they all fluttered out of the room, and then I think a Nordic came in.
Yes.
And try to calm him down, and then actually allowed him to sort of walk around. And then they went to like this big kind of like what I would say like a hangar, and he saw a bunch of other craft. It was like almost like he was in he was at some base somewhere that was clearly away from where he was taken, or where he actually interacted with the ship initially. So it's a crazy story.
Yeah, and then you have the other story of that Betty and Barney Hill, who were in the 1950s, and supposedly they were abducted, and she was shown a map of that
Zeta
Reticuli star system, and it was these are like the routes that we've gone. This is where we've explored, and at that time that star system wasn't really known. And I guess a few years later, the New York Times had published an article with that same map, not the one that she drew, but she saw it, and then she was able to put names to those different stars and like the routes and stuff. And, that's another very strange one. It makes me wonder, how many times people have been abducted and just not said anything about it,
Yeah. I mean, that's there's so many sort of like little rabbit holes on the whole topic. There is obviously the tech and people seeing it, and those reports, and clearly the military's been open now of recent with film footage and all this other stuff about it. And then you have the personal one-on-one interactions, and a lot of those involve the abductee scenarios.
Let's take a break right there.
Okay.
And then we'll come.
So there you have the tech side of things. Then you have the one-on-one experiences, the experiencers, I guess I would say who they are, and some of those involve abductees, and then and those stories. I mean, that's where the really wild stuff comes out. John Mack, who's a famous he Harvard professor of psychiatry, I think it was one of the real prominent figures in the 70s, him with Bud Hopkins, about the whole abductee scenario. And John Mack wrote a couple books, and there's a great biography on him if someone's interested to kind of deep into it. But basically with John Mack, he applied a very sort of like rigor around these interviews of these folks that were claiming that they were being abducted, and he was able to draw a bunch of different patterns that he would see across all these different folks that he was studying. And one of the main conclusions that he said, he goes, I don't know if their experiences are real or not. I just know they're not lying.
Yeah.
And these are folks that did not know each other. These were people that were not seeking fame. These are people that were just they were able to find through various things, and but the stories had a lot of parallels across the things, which kind of in my mind says I think there's some real there.
Yeah, there definitely is, and to go into like another fringe topic here that will relate to that is the remote viewing.
Yeah.
And that is, for me, that is kind of the definitive factor of like, is this stuff real? Because you hear that the government has been funding this for decades, and they're using it to look at supposed moon bases, right? And they're not giving these guys the information. It's not like you come in and you're a remote viewer and, hey, today we're going to go look at Mars. They just give them coordinates, or they, tell them to look at a certain area. And I listened to a podcast with one, I don't remember the guy's name, but he was talking about how he was asked to remote view an area, and it was a different time period, thousands of years ago, and supposedly it was on Mars.
Yeah, John McMonagle.
Yeah, that's him.
Yeah,
and that kind of like, if you ever read the Book of Enoch, which is like a book of the Bible that they discovered along with a book of Isaiah, which was, the book that they discovered was 1,000 years older than any recorded version of Isaiah that they had. These two documents were together, and it talks a lot about other planetary systems and, the giants who were fallen angels, and, how there are races of humans that had bred with these,
the daughters of man.
Yeah. And when you read it, it's almost like reading a science fiction novel, a very in-depth science fiction novel. And Enoch himself, it starts in the beginning, that when he was born, he was so bright that he like lit up the entire room. And with the Bible, sometimes it's hard to kind of discern, is that metaphorical or is that factual? But to me, it's strange that they didn't include that book in the Bible, because he's the grandfather of Noah.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, if you ask them like, who was Enoch, they have no idea, because you have to seek that out and find it. And there's a lot of versions of it, and the Ethiopian Bible has it in there. I listened to an audio book, and I would be listening to it, and I would just have to pause it and like go research some stuff online just to kind of understand what it was saying. But knowing how big of a factor Noah was in the Bible, it's almost kind of strange that this was not included. But I understand the reasoning behind it, because the Bible itself is, a conglomerate of different stories that men decided that these need to be included and these don't, right? So if you're making a book that is designed to tell a story and to control with laws, you definitely don't want to have some fringe stuff on there talking about extraterrestrials and, a disclosure document, basically.
Yeah, there's a great episode. There's a great podcast, American Alchemy, that features this last episode, has a lot of this conversation on it. And it was kind of the first episode that, because it's so hard to sort of organize in your mind all these different stories and how they all relate and all that. But it was kind of the first episode that put some, kind of zoomed out a little bit and allowed me to sort of maybe organize it a little bit better. But it talks about, so in the Book of Enoch, you obviously, or in the Bible too, you have the fallen angels, which is, God, cast out all the, those angels that, really the Satan, who was Lucifer, who was against God's commands and wanted, his own. So him and his angels were cast out. So you have fallen angels, and then you have what is also often mentioned in a lot of different script, which is the Watchers. And sometimes you conflate the two, like the Watchers, the fallen angels, so on, and maybe they are. And then you have the whole alien phenomenon that we're dealing with. Like, are we actually seeing what has been written before? Like, is these experiences is actually what has already been documented? And in any case, what what this guy talked about was that they are not necessarily the same, but the Watchers are. So in Greek mythology and in many different mythology, you have what's called the gods. Where they, Zeus and many others that sort of control a certain part of life. And these are like the little g gods. This isn't God, but this is like supernatural beings that interact with humanity in a certain way. That's not like unique to Greek mythology. It's unique to a lot of different, previously written things. But the point that I'm trying to get to is that what you were saying is that it was those little gods that were interacting with man here and creating offspring, and some of that offspring, or many offsprings, actually being the giants, and that was what precluded the flood. It was the flood, and the flood myth is also something that appears across every faith, and even in, even in sort of like, Aztec culture or Mayan culture, or, in China or whatever else, sort of disconnected cultures all talk about a flood.
Yeah.
And so that was the main event that sort of, it was big G God wiping out was what basically was a creation that was not of his doing.
Yeah.
So long way to say that many people think that the aliens are actually, or the extraterrestrials that we're interacting with could be remnants of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to me, as crazy as that sounds, it makes sense for sure. And, you look at, I think it's in the Aztec culture, Quetzalcoatl, who was, he arrived in Central America, and they call him, he rode on a feathered serpent, so he was on some type of a craft, because the way that they depict him, it's like he's riding a snake with feathers on it. I don't know what you can, describe that as, but clearly he was like on something that they had never seen before. And he kind of gave them this technology on how to build temples, and the fact that those temples are still standing, after thousands of years, it shows you that they had some kind of a technology that we no longer have. I mean, it's the same thing with the pyramids. These stones are perfectly placed. I don't care like what you try to convince me that they're using 10,000 men to move these stones. And when you see the pyramids, which I haven't been there, but I've watched these, people flying drones over them. They're massive. These stones are huge. And that same building technique is found all over the planet.
Yeah.
If you've ever watched that series that Graham Hancock did, I mean, he's in the Philippines, and they're using sonar and finding these pyramids underneath the ground. They're in Peru, South America. I mean, there's even some remnants of stuff here in North America. And I feel like, to kind of like, it's another topic, but to add on to this, there's a guy that lives up in Alaska, and it's called like the Alaskan Boneyard or something. And he's a gold hunter, but in the process of that, he found this area on his property, because they're using like high pressure cannons to spray this permafrost out. They find all these like short-faced bear, bison, all of these saber-toothed tigers, all in this one area. And I think that there was some type of massive disturbance that happened here in North America, and that's why this area was kind of like untouched for so long, and the rest of the world had kind of developed around that. And if you look at this, it's like clear that they were running from something, and whatever it was caught up to them, whether that's like a meteor explosion or some type of a nuclear war or whatever it was. And that's why you really don't see too many of these structures here in North America anymore.
Yeah, I mean, when I get in conversations like that with friends of mine that are obviously not into the subject, of course they look at me like I have three heads. But I sometimes I try to explain it like most people will say, if I can't see it, touch it, I don't believe it.
Yeah.
And then I started thinking like, okay, well, this phone that we all talk and look and pull up data on, we clearly can't see the Wi-Fi that's being, utilized to access the online, or we can't see, that we're not connected, with a wire between multiple phones when we're talking about it, but yet we accept it as reality because it is reality, right? So there's our spectrum can only visually see so much, and it's just like dogs can hear more than we can hear by by many thousands more than we can. So it's just like a lot of this stuff I think is actually among us and existing. We just can't perceive it. We're limited with our five senses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tend to agree with you there. There's a lot of talk about that string theory, which basically is, multiple dimensions lined up on top of each other. And this is how they're potentially traveling through time and space. It's not so much as like going from here to there. It's traveling through these dimensions. And I feel like seeing that explanation of the machine that Lazar saw, it's clearly creating a disturbance around it in a way that we have no way to describe. So taking that for what it's worth, there's got to be some kind of way that people are, not so much as people, but these devices can travel through dimensions and time and space.
Yeah, which kind of goes back to what are they? So I think there are a lot of things. I think they're interdimensionals, so I think they there's probably a portion of them that are like beings that are sort of live on just another plane beyond our plane. I think there are potentially space travelers that come in from another solar system that have to use what you just described, which is sort of bending space-time to get here, not linear, but just, and they may actually kind of intersect in those dimensions and come back out this way. And then you get into the whole, conversation around what we just discussed, which is like what the Enoch talks about, which could be, watchers, gods, whatever. So and spiritual realm and all that stuff. So it's a whole lot of things. I think the bottom line is I think we're, for the first time, we're at a place where people are talking openly about it, and I think the public is going to be exposed in a way that we've never been exposed before on information.
Yeah, and I think people are ready for it to a certain extent. Maybe, I feel like I want to know more, but at the same time, it's one of those things of like when you finally hear what it is, are you going to be happy with the result?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that. I know most of the time, people are not going to be ready for what they finally hear.
Yeah, and I mean, you think about, I guess more just like a parting point here, but one of the things that I think I'm surprised by, and maybe not so much, but because growing up, I grew up at a time where clearly there wasn't any cell phones, there wasn't a computer, like a home computer, and so, you grew up, running around playing outside and doing that kind of stuff. So, so many of us and our children and friends and so on are so captivated online and so distracted that all these things are going on around us, even when they sort of poke their head up and see that some announcements made, they're like they just stick their head back into to their own, world. And so I almost think like if there was a mass disclosure event, it may just be a thud.
Yeah. Or maybe okay. Let's watch the next cat video on TikTok.
Yeah.
When I wasn't born yet. My parents lived in an area called DeKalb, Texas. It's like really far northeast. My dad had a job working as an electrician at this place called Red River Army Depot. It's a massive facility that's operated by the government. And my mom was carrying groceries in one day. They'd gone to the grocery store. My sister, she's like 6 years older than me. I think she was like 3 or 4 at the time. And, my mom bends down into the trunk and she's lifting these groceries out, and all of a sudden she hears something that like sounds like a train. And she's thinking like there's no trains in this area. So she looks up and she sees this like massive thing flying overhead that's like, 500 feet off the ground or something, but it's huge and it's all like metallic and it's massive. I mean, the way she described it, it was like a football field size. And she runs in the house to tell my dad because she's freaked out, and when he comes out, there's like nothing there, and he didn't believe her. And then the very next day in the newspaper, there was an article about it that like all these people in the town had seen it.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder, was that facility that my dad was working at, like obviously it was like, I think they did something with ammunitions and stuff.
Yeah.
But there's could be potential, like it's very secluded. It's like, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas. There's not, if you've ever been in that area, it's not a well-populated area.
Right.
And it's kind of like what S4 was, there's like, at that time, Las Vegas wasn't very well populated. And I just wonder how many of these locations do they have around the United States and potentially the world where, that's these areas where it's not populated and they can do all of this testing and it's kind of right underneath our noses.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you just share. So I think the catalyst for me to be really interested in all that, I actually saw something too, and it was actually here in Dallas, and it was a, early spring day, and I was mowing my lawn, and I sat in my chair kind of after I got through under a tree, and I just sort of took a nap and then got up and was walking inside, and I looked up and I saw this perfectly looked like a medicine ball, just metallic medicine ball, just floating on top, probably 100 feet, if that, over my head. It was stable. And my first thought was like, that's the craziest Google drone I've ever, like, this must be like a Google drone, like just mapping the area, whatever else. Clear sky, nothing. I know I wasn't drinking or smoking or anything. It was just normal 10:30 in the morning day. And it moved slightly, and then it started moving into the one cloud that was in the sky. There wasn't any clouds, but this one big cloud moved right into it, and I watched it the whole time. And I had a pair of binoculars to my left, but I said, if I turn around, I'm gonna miss it. And I just sat there and watched it, and it impacted me so much that I actually called like the MUFON, which is like the kind of UFO. That you can like submit reports and all that stuff. And then ever since then, I was just fascinated.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it was, I don't know if it was last year or year before last, I'd never had any kind of experience of seeing anything. And, Susan and I and her sister were in Florida, and we were driving in Orlando to downtown to have some dinner. And I don't know why, but like it's night, and I just like happened to look up outside, and I see this like object moving through the sky, and it has like a tail behind it, and it's clearly it's not an airplane, because there's like occasionally there's like a burst of light that comes out from behind it, and we all three saw it. And I was thinking like, well, did they launch like a spaceship or something, and I got online, I couldn't find anything. And like you said, like, we were all like, oh, what was that? what are you having for dinner tonight? And I think that, I still think back on that, but I was driving on the freeway, so it's not like I could stop and like examine it. But it was kind of cloudy, and occasionally you would see it, and then some cloud cover would come in, and then you would see it again. And it was clearly moving at a extreme rate, but it must have been like, 30 to 50,000 feet in the air.
Yeah.
And it was very strange. And I don't know if it was, something that we've developed or something extraterrestrial, but yeah, I mean, my dad used to tell me stories all the time of when they were kids and they lived in Athens, Texas, that they would see glowing lights in the sky moving. Because where they lived, there were, it was way outside the city. And he told me they saw like a green light in the sky one time, and so they, typical rednecks, they shot at it. And he said as soon as they started shooting at it, it just kind of like took off extremely fast. And
wow,
this was the 1960s. So, but I mean, that's another thing that we don't really have here, especially living in like a modern world in the city. Is there's so much light pollution that you might see like the North Star and the moon or something, but there's a lot of stuff happening up there that you just can't see. We're kind of out of touch with.
Yeah, I'm I have a place East Texas, kind of near where you're talking about, and like you said, the light at night it's really nice. I had a really old guy come over one time. He was working. I have a well, and he was working on my well, and he asked me, "You ever see anything strange out here?" And I go, of course I just wanted to hear what he said. And I go, no, not really. He goes, you don't see any lights? And I go, no. Well, I said, why you ask? And he goes, well, just about 10 miles north of here. He goes, I've lived here all my life. He goes, there's a place where you can literally pull up and you just see orbs. That's all you see.
You sent me that photo series of from your trail cams where there's like orbs and lights, and you can't say it's light reflection or refraction, because it would be in like one location continuously. And this was like clearly each photo was like moving across. And, maybe that's like some interdimensional, your camera's picking that up. Who knows?
Man, who knows?
Yeah. Well, man, it's been a great podcast. I appreciate you coming out.
Of course.
And, we'll have to do it again sometime. There's so many other topics that I feel like we just like barely touched on it.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll continue it.
All right. Thanks, man.
Thanks.
For today's Kings of Kimuras episode. Thanks for joining us on this epic journey. Remember to keep training, stay curious, and always be ready for the next adventure. Until next time, keep your guards up and your minds open.